Hello everyone, today we will descend into the final hours of a man who became a symbol, not just of rebellion, but of unbreakable will. Imagine it, a summer dusk in the Scottish lowlands, the wind soft against the heather, yet something unnatural stirring in the air. In a clearing just beyond the edge of Robroston, a trap waits to be sprung. The man they seek moves like a shadow, unaware that familiar faces now wear the masks of betrayal. Before we get started on this story, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And when we reach the end, leave your thoughts in the comments. Was he a hero, a threat, or something more enduring? The night was still. The kind of stillness that made leaves sound louder when they moved. William Wallace had been on the run for months, ever since Falkirk broke his army and sent him into the dark woods and colder hills. His beard was longer now, streaked with silver and dust. His body thinner, his eyes sharper. He was not the roaring figure of legend here. Not a giant, not a phantom. Just a man in worn leather, traveling with a few loyal companions. And among them, one he did not know had turned. Sir John Menteith had once raised his cup beside Wallace. Sworn oaths. Fought under the same sun. But oaths bend beneath pressure, and gold weighs heavy in treacherous hands. Edward I of England had made his promise, "Bring me Wallace, and you will be richly rewarded." John obeyed. The betrayal was simple. A candle in the window of a farmhouse. A signal. Wallace never saw it. He had come seeking shelter, only to be greeted by steel. They came in silence first. English knights on foot, hoods drawn, blades glinting in the gloom. The moment Wallace stepped through the doorway, the door was barred behind him. He turned, but Menteith did not meet his eyes. One of the knights lunged. Wallace fought. Even exhausted, even half-starved, he moved like a man who had never stopped swinging a sword. He broke a jaw. He knocked another clean to the floor. But numbers overwhelm, and exhaustion is a merciless captor. He was struck from behind. Twice. 3 times. Shackles replaced sword hilt. Ropes dug into his wrists like thorns. Someone spit at him. Another whispered, "The king will be pleased." Dragged outside, his face bloodied, Wallace looked once at the stars. There was no moon that night, only the faintest wash of silver cloud moving over Robroston. One of the men muttered that perhaps even the heavens did not wish to see what was coming. Word spread fast across the glens. Wallace had been taken. Some wept. Some didn't believe it. Others whispered what many feared, that the cause was dead. Without Wallace, who would rally the clans? Who would dare? Edward had his victory, not on a battlefield, but in a dark corner of betrayal. They bound Wallace to a horse, not sitting, but tied like spoils of war. His head hung. His hair was matted. Still, he didn't speak. They struck him to provoke him, but he refused to curse. One of the younger soldiers whispered that Wallace had stared straight into his soul, and smiled. Days passed as they rode south. Through Stirling. Through the border towns. Each village marked his passing like a funeral procession in reverse. No flowers. Just jeers. "Traitor!" they shouted. "Murderer!" Yet some did not yell. Some stood silent, hats pressed to hearts, tears pooling in hardened eyes. At the edges of the roads, children asked who the man was. Mothers gave them answers they would remember for the rest of their lives. And when at last they reached London, the smell of ash and rot clung to the summer air. The tower stood in the distance like a waiting beast. But Wallace was not taken there, not yet. He was led through the city, bound, barefoot, filthy from the road. The people gathered like crows. It was August 1305, and the capital was starving for spectacle. For years they had heard his name, William the Savage, the giant, the demon of Stirling Bridge. And now? A man. No armor. No horse. No fire in his limbs, just the eyes. He walked with a limp. His wrists were bruised. His chest rose and fell with effort. But when they hurled filth, he did not flinch. When they roared with laughter, he looked past them, as if already in another world. The crowd didn't know what to do with that. Behind him, the sound of hooves announced the arrival of English heralds. One unfurled a scroll and read aloud Wallace's charges: treason, rebellion, slaughter. The words echoed off the stone. But Wallace did not lower his head. Instead, he looked up, perhaps toward the sky, or beyond it. One soldier later swore he heard Wallace whisper something then. Not a prayer. Not a curse. Just one word. Scotland! The next morning, the sentence began, not with blade or rope, but with humiliation. The English wanted more than death. They wanted a lesson carved into flesh, drawn out until it soaked into the stones of the city, and clung to the memory of all who watched. William Wallace was stripped of what little remained to him. Not just his clothing, his dignity, his name, his freedom to even fall with grace. They bound him to a wooden hurdle, a crude sledge used to drag criminals through mud and manure. His arms were stretched, his ankles tied. Flies gathered. So did people. At first light, the gates of Newgate prison opened with a groan, and the crowd surged forward. The wheels of the cart ground against cobblestone. Wallace lay motionless on the wood, filth caking his skin, the rough rope biting deep. Behind him, guards rode in pairs, armed with spears and clubs, not to defend him, but to keep the crowd from swarming too close. They didn't want mercy, these onlookers. They wanted proximity to vengeance. Children ran ahead, shouting. Vendors pushed through, hawking ale and meat pies as if it were a festival. One man sold crude sketches of Wallace, drawn with devil horns, stamped with the word traitor beneath. But not everyone laughed. From shadowed alleys and open shutters, quiet eyes watched. Eyes that remembered Sterling. Eyes that had whispered his name as something more than a rebel, something sacred. They said nothing. But their silence was heavy. They held it like grief. Through Cheapside he was dragged, past the markets where Londoners bargained and bickered. Every jolt of the cart scraped his skin against wood. Blood mixed with mud. He clenched his jaw. They wanted him to scream. To beg. But the man who had watched comrades fall on frozen battlefields did not give them that sound. Near Smithfield, the crowd thickened. Someone threw a stone, it missed, striking a guard instead. There was laughter. A man shouted, "Show us the savage!" and others echoed. But Wallace only blinked against the sun, his face a mask of weariness and something deeper, a quiet defiance that made even some of the English shift uneasily. Then came Ludgate Hill. The incline was steep. The cart lurched. A wheel cracked slightly under the weight. Wallace's head hit the boards with a hollow thud. Blood from his lips stained the wood. From above, nobles watched from windows, sipping wine as though witnessing sport. One leaned out and asked, "Is this the man they feared?" Another replied, "A ghost in chains." At the base of the hill, a woman threw a white cloth. It fluttered down and landed on Wallace's chest. A guard snatched it away, sneering, but he did not see the look she gave, steady, unblinking. And so the cart moved on. Past St. Paul's. Past the murmuring clergy who said prayers for the soul of England but not for the man bound before them. They reached Westminster at last, where justice, so-called, would be delivered. There, in the great hall, a throne of sorts had been built, not for a king, but for judgment. The platform was elevated. Wallace was lifted roughly, half-dragged, and placed in chains before it. His knees shook but did not buckle. Before him sat the lords of England, robed and rotted in their certainty. The charge, high treason. The punishment, to be hung, drawn, and quartered. He was not permitted to speak in defense. Not truly. But he spoke anyway. "I never swore fealty to Edward," he said. "So how could I betray him?" The hall went still. One of the barons scoffed. Another waved dismissively. But a few leaned in, uncomfortable with the precision of truth. He was condemned all the same. His words meant nothing against their need to crush him utterly. And so, they dragged him out once more. Across the green, a scaffold had been prepared. Not for execution, no, not yet. First, the display. The people gathered like waves, surging closer, the air thick with heat and expectation. Wallace was hoisted again onto the hurdle and drawn the last stretch towards Smithfield. Here, the noise was thunder. They hurled insults, stones, scraps of meat. But Wallace looked beyond it all. To the sky. To the clouds drifting slowly, indifferently overhead. To the wind in the trees at the edge of the square. And somewhere in the crowd, a young man watched silently, hand clenched over his heart. His father had died at Falkirk. His mother whispered Wallace's name like a prayer. And now, seeing him so reduced, so ruined, and still unbowed, something was planted deep in that boy. Not just sorrow. Not just rage. But purpose. Wallace would not see it bloom. But he had already sown it. The scaffold creaked. Ropes tightened. The English executioners tested the pulley, their hands sticky with sweat and anticipation. Wallace stood at its base now. Barefoot. Broken. And yet tall. The sun was high now, casting hard shadows over Smithfield Market. There was no more time to delay, no more distance left to drag. William Wallace stood at the foot of the scaffold, eyes fixed not on the crowd, not on the executioners, but on the far horizon, as though the fields of Scotland still lived in his mind green and free. A hush settled over the mob. It wasn't reverence. It was hunger. The Lord High Justice stepped forward and read aloud the charges once more, though none were listening. Wallace had been judged already. His punishment was not about guilt. It was about theater. About making an example so dreadful that the very memory would throttle rebellion in its crib for generations. And then it began. The hangman approached, thick arms, hooded face, and hands like butcher's slabs. He fastened the noose around Wallace's neck, rough, coarse hemp. It had been soaked the night before to make it heavier. Not to kill quickly, but to strangle slowly. Wallace said nothing. He was hoisted into the air, his feet flailing above the wooden boards. The crowd roared. His body jerked, legs kicking, chest convulsing. But they had practiced this, cut him down too soon, just as death neared, and he would live, just long enough. When he crashed back onto the boards, Wallace didn't scream. He sucked air like a man drowning, each breath burning. His shoulders trembled. Blood trickled from his nose. A child in the crowd turned away. His mother did not. They stripped him further, what little remained, and laid him on a low table made of iron and oak. Iron rings clamped around his wrists and ankles, spreading his limbs wide. His breath was hoarse. His face gray. The next phase was crude, intimate, and silent in preparation. The executioner's tools were rolled out, a blade curved like a crescent moon, hot tongs, a small saw. Men who had seen war turned away. A herald raised his voice over the restless crowd. By order of His Majesty King Edward, this man, William Wallace, is to suffer death by treason, to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. The words droned on, but no one heard the rest. The blade entered his flesh with surgical calculation. Not for speed, but spectacle. They made a show of opening him, inch by inch, the smell of blood now thick in the warm air. People fainted. Others laughed nervously. The most bloodthirsty cheered, but it sounded uncertain now, uneasy. Wallace remained silent. Only his hands twitched against the bindings. Only his jaw tightened, as if each cut he received was another nail in England's illusion of control. Then the worst began. The drawing was not symbolic, it was literal. His intestines were pulled from his body slowly, wound about a stick, exposed to the light and air. The executioner lifted them as if displaying a trophy. A priest approached then, rosary trembling, offering final rites. Wallace turned his head slightly. Not to the priest, but toward the crowd. His lips moved, barely audible. A witness near the front would later swear that he said, "Tell them, I'd die for freedom." There was no record made. But the rumor spread. And the rumor became legend. The executioner continued. Wallace was still alive. The lungs struggled. The heart beat weakly. The body was torn, desecrated, but the man within refused to yield. It was not resistance now. It was something else. A final, unspoken defiance. Even the guards began to sweat. The cheers died. People now watched in silence. Some crossed themselves. Some wept. And some simply walked away, unable to bear it. At last, when they could draw no more from him, when blood pooled beneath him and breath came in shallow gasps, they reached for his heart. The final gesture. The executioner's blade plunged deep. He cut the heart free from Wallace's chest with a slow, practiced motion, then held it aloft. "This was the heart of a traitor," he bellowed. But not everyone agreed. One boy near the back whispered, "No. That was the heart of a lion." They would not know his name. Not for years. But his voice would join the many that carried Wallace's name into legend. The remains were not given a grave. No tomb. No prayers. His body was quartered, each limb sent to different corners of the kingdom, Newcastle, Berwick, Perth, and Stirling. His head? Dipped in tar and placed atop London Bridge. A warning. A deterrent. But wind and rain do strange things to memory. What was meant to rot became instead a relic. Travelers looked up and told their children the story of the man whose eyes still seemed to watch. And far from London, in the hills of Scotland, songs were sung in secret. Tales told by firelight. And each one began the same way. "There once was a man who could not be broken." The wind over London Bridge was harsh the next morning. It carried the salt of the Thames and the stink of the city. But for those who dared look up, it also carried something else, dread. Mounted high on the spike, above the water and the wagons and the wandering eyes, was the head of William Wallace. His hair, once a banner of rebellion, now stiffened with pitch. His face, or what remained of it, turned ever so slightly eastward, as though still looking home. The crows did not come, not right away. Perhaps even they sensed something unholy about it, something that would not rot like other men. Below, life resumed. The markets bustled, the galleys moored, the nobles plotted. But among the people, a murmur lingered. Some would not walk beneath the bridge. Others crossed themselves. A few dared to whisper prayers. In the shadow of the scaffold where Wallace had died, a boy returned. The same one who had spoken softly amid the screams. The boy whose father had fallen at Falkirk. He stared at the boards still stained dark where Wallace's life had spilled. No one stopped him. No one spoke to him. He knelt. Not to pray, but to remember. Meanwhile, far to the north, in Stirling and beyond, the fragments of Wallace's body arrived like cursed relics. Hung high, left to decay in the open air, they were warnings placed with deliberate cruelty. But the message, meant to crush, had the opposite effect. In Berwick, a shepherd's wife saw the severed arm nailed to the gate. She turned her son's face away, but not before he asked, "Whose was it?" And she, trembling, answered not with the word, "Traitor," but Wallace. In that moment, the name changed. Not just a man. Not even a martyr. A memory sharpened into myth. Edward I believed he had won. In his eyes, Wallace was finished. Scotland was fractured. Its leaders squabbling. Its people too tired to rise again. But empires often mistake silence for surrender. Wallace's death did not erase his cause. It branded it into the minds of every man who had once followed him, and many who had not. In secret glens and remote villages songs grew. Quiet at first. Then bolder. A pipe played by a lone shepherd in the dusk, a tale whispered beside a winter hearth. And always the same story, that Wallace had died not begging, but staring his killers in the eye. That he had breathed his last breath not in fear, but with pride. Back in London, something else began to spread, unrest. The crowd that had once cheered his torment now wrestled with what they had witnessed. A few claimed they had heard him speak with angels. Others said the sun darkened at the moment his heart was torn out. The tales grew more spectral with each retelling. Some swore his ghost walked the halls of Westminster, dragging chains that no man could see. Whether true or not, the English crown grew restless. Edward aged fast in the years that followed. His bones ached. His mood soured. He heard the name Wallace in every whisper of rebellion, every report of Scottish defiance. Even on his deathbed, years later, he gave orders that Wallace's bones, if ever gathered, were never to be buried whole. He feared a grave would become a shrine. And he was right. Wallace had no tomb, but he had something far more powerful, memory. And memories do not stay buried. In the years that followed, Robert the Bruce would rise. The wars would rage again. And Wallace's ghost, real or not, would ride with them in every charge, in every desperate shout for freedom. The scaffold at Smithfield was taken down. Another was built. And another. But none stayed as long in the mind as the one that had held Wallace. It became a scar on the square. Invisible, but never forgotten. And in time, the English themselves began to change how they spoke of him. No longer a beast. No longer a savage. Some, grudgingly, called him a warrior. A few, quietly, carefully, called him a hero. A strange thing, legacy? It slips from the hands of kings and lodges instead in the hearts of commoners. Years later, when Scotland stood once again to claim its name, men wore simple brooches marked with a thistle and a single word, Wallace. And so, in death, he lived. Not in marble. Not in books. But in blood. Years passed. Then decades. The old wooden scaffold at Smithfield Market was long dismantled, its timbers rotted or burned, the boards that once held Wallace's final breath replaced by the passing feet of merchants and soldiers. Yet the ground remembered. Even when cities forget, stones do not. In the hills of Scotland, they spoke his name with reverence and fury. Around hearths, old men spoke of the time before, the time when Wallace walked like thunder across the land. Mothers whispered tales to their children as lullabies, turning gallows into gospel. No monument rose for him then. No statue, no slab of stone. Only stories. But stories have roots, and roots crack even the hardest foundations. In London, Wallace's head stayed atop the bridge for months, blackened, brittle, defiant in silence. But time is a tireless eraser. Eventually, the tar peeled, the skin withered. The winds of autumn tore at the ragged beard, and the rains of winter hollowed his cheeks. One day, quietly, the guards removed it. There was no ceremony. No trumpet. Only the slow creak of wood and the quiet sigh of fear that remained. And still, he would not vanish. Years later, a merchant from York told of a dream, a man bound in chains, standing tall amid fire, whispering freedom, with lips that no longer bled. Another claimed to have seen his reflection in the Thames on a still day. Such tales were laughed at, of course. But never too loudly. South of Stirling, in a quiet glen, a cairn of stones appeared one morning. No one saw who built it. No name was carved. No inscription given. But every week, another stone appeared. And over time it rose. Not high. Not proud. But steady. It stood for what could not be destroyed. By the turn of the century, Wallace was no longer just a name. He had become the spark that refused to die. His limbs had been scattered, his voice silenced, his body torn, but his soul, in the minds of his people, had only scattered like seed. And from those seeds came resistance. Robert the Bruce, who had once fought against Wallace's will, now carried that legacy forward. At Bannockburn, where thunder met blood and Scotland's heartbeat shook the earth, Wallace's memory stood unseen beside every blade raised against the English. The tide turned. Not all at once. Not forever. But enough. And when Scotland took its breath again, shaky, tattered but its own, it did so standing on Wallace's bones. Later generations sought to capture him in bronze and stone. Tall statues, grand monuments, paintings with eyes too blue, hair too gold. And films, of course, the films, shouting his name with fury and fire. But the truth of him was quieter. Stranger. Stronger. He had no crown, yet ruled hearts. He wielded no title, yet wore the burden of a nation's hope. And though his voice was silenced by rope and blade, its echo carried further than any king's decree. At Royston, where betrayal first found him, grass now grows thick over the path he walked. But when the wind moves just right, it said you can still hear boots in the dark, measured, deliberate. Not fleeing. Returning. At Smithfield, beneath the crush of modern noise, some say they've heard whispers, low and firm, when dusk falls over the stones. Scotland! They murmur. Not a word. A vow. And in the heart of every people who've tasted the steel of chains and dreamed of breaking them, Wallace lives again, not as myth, not as martyr, but as memory forged in pain and purpose. In the end, it was not his sword that endured. It was his silence. That final, breathless moment, no plea, no cry, no surrender. A man disemboweled, destroyed, but not defeated. And though the English tore his body apart, they could not keep his soul bound. He had passed from man to story. And stories, once believed, never die.